All right, YouTube. Vladimir Putin has announced that Russia's getting the fuck out of Syria. Whether this is sort of their idea of a diversionary tactic, sort of you claim you're leaving, you withdraw your visible forces and leave some behind, sort of undercover or not, kind of remains to be seen. Russia apparently has decided that getting further involved in the region would be a quagmire, sort of a throwback to what people like Dick Cheney themselves said in the 90s regarding the U.S. plan to go into Iraq at the time, before W brought us in and it was all fucked up and worthless, and we spent trillions of dollars and lost thousands of lives for nothing. Putin has decided, apparently, to cut his losses there. My own thought is this: Russia does not have the projective capability to wage a proxy conflict in Ukraine and Syria at the same time. Ukraine's right on their border. If they need to get physically involved there, they don't need naval forces, which are more expensive to operate. Whereas Syria, they don't share a land border with Russia. They have to go around Turkey as well. They've had continuous problems there because Turkey's in NATO. It just makes sense, essentially, to withdraw from the region. There's now so much instability in Syria and Iraq between ISIS, the FSA, the Kurds, Assad's forces, Turkish forces at various times, the French conducting bombing missions, and so forth. There are so many different groups involved within the region that it's probably fairly difficult to actually tell who's doing what at any given time and thus coordinate it to be effective. The one of the few things that Obama has said that made any sense. Now, did he follow through with this? No, of course not. He's a complete warmonger. He's a chicken hawk. You would never see him in a helmet and a bulletproof vest going over there and doing anything. But what Obama said at least made sense, which was, it's not necessarily something we need to get further involved in. Certainly, putting ground troops there is a terrible idea. One thing that Trump has said that disturbed me most was actually the concept of sending in troops to establish safe zones within Syria. Now, perhaps this is a better alternative than most of Syria's population leaving and becoming refugees. That's potentially true. But if you set up a safe zone inside of the countries without actually wiping ISIS off the face of the earth, which I think would be more difficult to do than most people believe, then it doesn't really matter. You set up the safe zone, then you withdraw. ISIS comes back and fills the vacuum up. It doesn't bring long-term stability. The only thing in Syria that can bring long-term stability is allowing Assad to regain control of his country, the way that it used to be. Just like the only way to bring stability to Iraq after we invaded would have been to allow Saddam Hussein to continue on as the person in power. The strongman system is the only thing that's kept pan-nationalists, which is what the Islamofascists really are, they want a caliph state, from filling the void anytime one of these states destabilizes. We failed to do that. Iraq is fucked. The Shiite government there could potentially have remained in control. The problem is their next door neighbor got fucked up, ISIS grew, then ISIS poured back across the border into Iraq. And for some months, the Shiite government there was completely ineffective at fighting back, to the point where, where troops had to be dropped on certain bases around Baghdad just to keep it from potentially falling into the hands of ISIS, because that would have crushed the state completely. Russia has decided not to fall into the same trap that we have fallen into so many times, and which they have as well. You would think of Afghanistan in the 1980s, which was their version of Vietnam. You have tens of thousands of dead Soviet troops. You have ruined tanks and planes and everything else scattered across the steppe and the mountains. They failed to actually do anything. It cost a lot. It marched them further towards their own economic and military ruin, which is why one of the major causes of the USSR getting fucked. They no longer looked invincible, because here they were, they couldn't even compete there. The United States managed to more or less stabilize Afghanistan. The problem was we were doing that at the same time that we were also trying to nation build in Iraq. It's very difficult, even with as much projective force as the United States has, from halfway across the world to nation build in two places at once. Extremely difficult. The Russians can't even pull it off just in Syria because they're already mired in Ukraine. A lot of people would like to pretend that that situation is over. It's not. The Russians will advance again at some point, or the anti-Russian groups will advance again at some point, and the fighting will begin anew. It's what happens in these sort of proxy conflicts. Meanwhile, the DPRK is steadily marching off a cliff as well, because new sanctions there are tougher than they have been in about half a century. And the DPRK is starting to run out of critical supplies, not just food. I mean, they're in a famine as well. They've had a fairly bad drought now for several years. They're low on food, and the Chinese aren't ponying it up this time. They're also unable to sell their coal. Even the Chinese at this point, which had been neutral, are turning back a lot of North Korean goods. The Russians have come out and warned them, you're giving a cause for war to the South Koreans, the Japanese, the United States. You need to cut it out. Kim Jong-un's response has been, we're going to conduct another nuclear test. And if he does that, then you've got more sanctions. He may, at some point, with tensions that high, you could have an accident turn into an actual war. I've said for the last year or so, the DPRK is not acting like it certainly did when I was younger. It's acting totally different. It's always acted, they've always done the whole, we're going to fire a few missiles off and the Chinese will send us rice to calm us down. They've always done that. But this time it's a little different because for the first time they're standing alone. The Chinese aren't helping them. The Russians are almost hostile towards them at this point. Little bit different scenario. They are a small state. They don't have a lot of agricultural capabilities. They've got a lot of minerals and they've got a lot of coal. They don't have a lot of oil, though, and they certainly don't have enough arable land to feed their entire population unless weather is just perfect and they're actually in a drought and a famine, and it looks like it might continue through this year, in which case people will begin to starve. It could destabilize the state. Ultimately, I think an overthrow of Kim Jong-un's regime by the military there and a movement to the Chinese system is probably the most likely outcome. I don't think it'll lead to open war, but it's a possibility, and it's a greater possibility than it has been. Putin may be also very worried about diverting some resources to that general region right now. Putin is, I think, intelligent enough not to want to get caught with his pants down if and when the DPRK goes off kilter, because they do have, Syria doesn't have nuclear weapons. ISIS might have some dirty bomb materials, although that's not a certainty at this point. But we know the DPRK has atomic weapons, at least. They claim to have hydrogen bombs. The last test they conducted was not a hydrogen bomb test. They're not capable of miniaturizing these things and putting them on a long-range missile. Nor, by the way, do they have anything other than prototype long-range missiles actually capable of hitting anything further than Alaska. So most of the continental United States, they're very worried about this new type of Dong missile. They haven't really performed a reliable test. They're getting there, but they're not there yet. I have a feeling that if at any time the United States or China or Russia thinks that the North Koreans are actually becoming capable of making a hydrogen bomb, that invasion will ensue immediately. And you'll see the three greater world powers ass raping the DPRK together, and carving the Russians will come in and occupy a little section. The Chinese will occupy the northern half of what's left. South Korea, Japan, the United States will march north towards Pyongyang. It'll end up a little bit like the Berlin Wall situation, potentially, depending on what happens diplomatically. But I think that might be one of the reasons Putin is right now leaving. You've got North Korea ignoring the UN's resolution. Which happens all the time, but it's just another step in the wrong direction for their regime. You have them threatening to conduct another nuclear test. You've got to realize it hasn't conducted that many nuclear tests in its history, because it's only lately become a nuclear state anyway. You're looking at, I believe, 2004 was the first nuclear test, and that one was a failure. Next year, they conducted one that was a success, and then they conducted one more before the most recent. Now they're saying they're going to conduct another this year. If they do, it's going to get a lot of people in China very worried, because at this point, the Chinese government understands that they're the unstable little brother. It'd be like if Israel were conducting nuclear tests every few years, probably people would be more concerned about their rogue nuclear program that they still haven't declared. They did conduct one in joint efforts with the South Africans. The South Africans sort of destroyed their own program. I guess they got nervous. Now the Israelis have some hydrogen bombs as well that they don't have declared. But in the case of North Korea, of course, they're a complete pariah at this point. So I think that Putin is somewhat concerned ultimately about the other side of his country and no longer has the resources necessary to divert to Syria. Also, Putin, I don't think, can gain anything by keeping Russian troops there. You know, Assad is better able to keep a lid on the situation. You leave him some weapons and some jets and so forth, and then you get the fuck out, and you let Assad take care of it. I think that's probably the best thing the United States... The U.S. should be working with Russia and with Assad in Syria at this point. I found it very strange that Trump didn't come out at the debate before last when Cruz said, well, and Rubio as well, well, you know, we need to arm our allies within the region. We need to keep arming these moderate groups. Why didn't Trump come out and say you trust Obama to determine which groups we should be arming after Fast and Furious and so forth? It would have been a big win for him if he had actually mentioned that. I don't know why he didn't. But my answer is no. I don't trust Obama to make that judgment call because he's clearly been wrong in most of his efforts at arming different groups. The so-called moderates are just a bunch of nationalist Islamofascists as opposed to the kind that want a caliph state. That's the only real difference. They do the same things. They still cut people's heads off. They still burn them alive. They still deploy chemical weapons. The FSA deployed chemical weapons. It was not Assad doing that. It was the FSA. We know that. The UN report came out. They determined they couldn't determine that it was Assad that did that. The United States immediately said, well, Obama and Kerry said, oh, it was obviously Assad that did this, because at the time Obama was warmongering and saying we should fire off missiles and kill Assad and destroy his forces. If he had been successful in convincing the public to do that, the war in Syria would right now not be sort of boiling away. It would be completely gone. There'd be nothing left of the Syrian state by now. Iraq would be completely destabilized. Most of the region would be suffering even more than it is right now. It's really ultimately better to let Assad tackle ISIS within his territory and prop up the Iraqis. And we've somewhat successfully been doing that. There's no reason to rock the boat. Unfortunately, when Putin leaves, some of the warmongering neocons in the United States, not just Republicans, people like Hillary and Kerry as well, will be calling for a renewed U.S. effort to bomb more things. They'll attack Assad's forces whenever they can, or allow the FSA to do it, and it'll be a problem going forward. This is what Obama has been trying to do since day one. Look at what happened in Libya. Glorious revolution, only now Libya is basically destroyed. ISIS is actually there as well. The cancer has metastasized to some extent. So yeah, there's a little bit of my opinion about Putin saying he's going to withdraw from Syria. I think he's more worried right now about North Korea, honestly, an atomic state right on his doorstep on the other coast. And really doesn't want to be caught with his pants around his ankles, unprepared, with most of his troops already at other fronts, when North Korea very likely in the future destabilizes and undergoes regime change of one sort or another. That's about all. Peace out.